What better title for this video than complexity, where I am fumbling over buttons and switches and live streaming software and settings and titles and tweets. It's an appropriate series of bumbles. Just made two in case you weren't paying attention. So I wanted to get this done in an unusual time. It's almost 9 o'clock here in Los Angeles, because if I don't, it's going to get postponed for days because my schedule is busy the next few days. So thought I would do an impromptu late night for me live stream. And good morning to the folks in Europe. It's almost 6 a.m. there. Okay, so let's do a quick audio check. Sounds good. And let's talk about complexity. And I'm going to try to make a case, just some thoughts based on something I read. So I get newsletters, and like some email newsletter I signed up for years ago. I have no recollection how I discovered this blog or this person and this post. And let me scoot that over a little bit. Okay, there we go. So there is someone named Shane Paris, and he writes a blog called the Farnham Street Blog. It's his website. And I can't recall like how I came across him, if he wrote a book or what the connection was. But some reason I signed up for his newsletter. And honestly, I don't know that I've ever read one. I can't recall reading them. But recently, one popped into my inbox, and for whatever reason, I clicked on it. And again, for some other crazy reason, I actually read just one or two sentences out of the top of the email, and it caught my eye. And it was this statement: complexity is like energy. It cannot be created or destroyed, only moved somewhere else. And I just stopped cold. I was like, what are we talking about here? So, like a good newsletter, it made me click through to see what was going on here. And the link was to a blog post: Why Life Can't Be Simpler. And I was like, okay, I'm game. I'm interested. I've contemplated on the myriad facets and complexities of life, and anyone with kids would know that things tend to get a little more complex as you have kids in the house and you're just juggling all the roles and tasks and responsibilities that come at you. But then I read this paragraph and I'm like, wait, this doesn't seem like the complexity of life. I was kind of puzzled. So we'd all like life to be simpler. Sure, a common catchphrase, or, whether it's meaningful or not, I don't know, but you'll hear that phrase a lot, right? But we also don't want to sacrifice our options and capabilities. And at this point, I was like, I'm going to pick an argument. Tesler's law of the conservation of complexity, which I'll mention, a rule from design, explains why we can't have both. Okay, so remember that phrase, why we can't have both. And that's why I'm kind of arguing with the title and the whole blog post, essentially. And here's how the law can help us create better products and services by rethinking simplicity. But wait a minute, the title says life can't be simpler, but then he talks about better products and services. So, like, there's a lot going on here, and I'm sure he had something in mind. I'm sure he's 10 times smarter than I am, but I don't know that this blog post is as well composed as could have been. So, question, why can't life be simple? Life can't be simple? Life? Like, I don't know. So I was kind of skeptical at this point. It's the law. It's Tesler's law. That sounds very authoritative. It's the law of conservation of complexity. Sounds scientific, like conservation of energy. It cannot be broken. But you need to read it more carefully. For any system, there is a certain amount of complexity which cannot be reduced. Okay, so it's leading somewhere, right? So fine, I can accept that in principle. And it goes on, if I go to this website where you see a link, a good website, it is, I don't have it here, but it is linked here. Anyway, the core, one statement that's key, the core of complexity that cannot be designed away, okay? It's a very important stipulation there. That complexity must be assumed by the system or user. Okay, so we have a baseline. You can simplify as much as you want, but at some point you have a core level of complexity. Okay, I can kind of accept that. And it has a few kind of tenets to this. All processes as a core of complexity can't be designed away. Ensure as much as possible the burden is lifted from users by you dealing with the inherent complexity, kind of hide that. Take care not to simplify interfaces to the point of abstraction. I didn't really look at that. That's a little abstract for me, ironically. So my counter argument to this, and I'll try to make the case for this, is we are rarely anywhere near the core of complexity. And sorry, having a little slide alignment challenges here. So my counter argument, we are rarely near the core. And so that's a very, very important tenet of this entire discussion, which I think is kind of not well addressed in this blog post. And that's where things start to fall apart. And so it starts with a bad analogy. And as with many analogies are imperfect attempts to describe some other concept, an attempt to simplify them in other terms that you might understand. But analogies are inherently weak. They are inherently flawed because they are not the thing they are trying to describe. They are a substitute, and as a substitute, they aren't perfect. So here we go with our bad analogy. Every day we face processes that seem infinitely recursive. We confront tools requiring us to memorize reams of knowledge, and like getting utilities connected in a new home. Like, okay, that's an interesting analogy. Or figuring out the controls for a fridge. Really? This was the killer analogy. Ends up having numerous perplexing steps. Okay, that's one way to argue. I'm going to try to counter that. When we wish for things to be simpler, we usually mean we want products and services to have fewer steps, fewer controls, fewer options. Perhaps I can understand that perspective. Less to learn. But at the same time, we still want all of the same features and capabilities. In a very shallow, thoughtless interpretation, perhaps, and this is where I'm going to argue, this post seems to argue that complexity is fundamentally inherent and cannot be absolved. In fact, a few slides earlier, life cannot be simpler. And it is the conservation of complexity. And so I would argue that this is a false argument. So if you go on to read, he mentions a reference to, I guess, a book, Living with Complexity, which this is a strange aside. Complexity is all in the mind, but complexity is this inherent thing that cannot be eliminated. So I'm a little confused here. Our perception of a product or service as simple or complex has its basis in the conceptual model we have of it. Okay. A conceptual model is the underlying belief structure held by a person about how something works. And we're starting to get kind of abstract here, so stay with me. Complexity is all in the mind. Belief structure held by a person about how something works. So if I think my car runs on unicorn dreams, like it, what does this even mean? It's like abstracting complexity to the point of just human psychological fiction. Like, this is a very smushy quote that was pulled, and maybe the book has better substance, but I'm not sold. Okay, going on. Complex tools end up making our lives simpler because they provide the precise functionality we want. Really? Do they really? I'll make a case for that, against that. Removing functionality doesn't make something simpler because it removes options. I disagree. I fundamentally disagree. Yes, I'm sure you could come up with some use cases where this is true, but as a general statement, I just disagree. Trying to do something complex with a simple tool is more complex than doing the same thing with a more complex tool. Well, maybe. You could come up with cases for that, perhaps, but as a fundamental premise that complexity cannot be eliminated, it must simply be transferred, I reject the premise. And so it sounds like the premise that complexity must be maintained. And the reason I'm talking about this is business processes, software, human software interactions, UX, UI, complex systems, right? Like, oh, they're complex. It's fundamentally complex. Throw my hands up. There's nothing I can do. It's just complexity. Complexity is like energy. It cannot be created or destroyed. Well, that's a great excuse to use in my next meeting with a customer. I'm sorry, it's just complex. It's going to cost you 120 hours for me to fix that, right? Like, no, I disagree. Complexity can only be moved somewhere else. Sometimes it can. It's not the only option. When a product or service becomes simpler for users, engineers and designers have to work harder. Not necessarily. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. With technology, simplifications at the level of usage invariably result in added complexity of the underlying mechanism. Fundamentally disagree. I've simplified processes, I've simplified UI, I've simplified software, simplified interfaces, and it reduced complexity on the overall system because we just realized, why are we doing these 10 things when we could do these 3? It took 5 minutes of thought, but it wasn't some overwrought process that we were tortured by. It's simply an analysis. And the last sentence, what is simple on the surface can be incredibly complex inside. Sure, it could be. What is simple inside can result in an incredibly complex surface, but it is not mandatory. I do not believe that complexity must be maintained. I assert that complexity can be reduced, but. So the word complexity keeps being used as if like there's these attempts to explain it, but then it's like this finite, fixed, concrete, amorphous thing, complexity. Sorry, it's complex. I disagree. And let's use the bad analogy of the refrigerator. Let's talk about refrigerator complexity, which is very timely, since I have been shopping for a refrigerator for many months and just got a new one. So this is a refrigerator. That is all it is. It is a 23 cubic foot refrigerator, counter depth for those who know the lingo. It has a glass door. It automatically opens its doors. Think about that. These auto open doors are both motion and voice activated. Think about that. It has auto open drawers because, obviously, it has Wi-Fi. It connects with Alexa, Google Assistant, and many others that do that type of thing because it's a refrigerator. Of course. It has a mobile app. Obviously. It has 2 ice makers, one in the door, one in the freezer. It weighs nearly 450 pounds. Let me tell you, that's kind of heavy for a refrigerator. And it costs $8,000 retail. It is just a refrigerator. I'm sorry, complexity is inherent. There's nothing we can do to simplify this refrigerator. And even if we work really hard, maybe we can simplify your Wi-Fi and Alexa integration, but I'm sorry, complexity just can only be shifted so much. Well, if we actually paid attention to some of the statements before about complexity, this is the core of complexity. This is a 24 cubic foot refrigerator, slightly larger. It has no water dispenser. It has no ice maker. It only weighs 188 pounds and it costs $1,000. It keeps food cold. It keeps food frozen. It is a refrigerator. And so to argue that the $8,000 beast is complex and to throw your hands up, and those options are things we're unable to, give up, I would argue that this refrigerator exists for $1,000. Therefore, any complexity on that 8,000 one is not necessarily essential. And anyone who has gone to college and been poor and been eating, ramen out of a dorm room or had a couple Cokes, you will recognize this gem. This is the ubiquitous dorm room fridge. And this particular one is a larger one that I grabbed, 4.4 cubic feet, 60 pounds, $399. I actually know someone, an adult who lives in an apartment, has a fridge like this. That's all he needs. He literally doesn't need anything else. I think his electricity bill is like $30 a month or just some inconceivable number. So, core of complexity, right? So now let's talk about belief structures. I learned about a belief structure in my family that I didn't know existed. The refrigerator on the left is 25 cubic feet. It has door water and door ice. It is 262 pounds and costs $2,600. The fridge on the right is also 25 cubic foot. It's the exact same refrigerator and freezer. The only difference is it does not have water in the door. It does not have ice in the door, but it does have an ice maker in the freezer. It is lighter at 233 pounds. It essentially the same fridge, $1,500. I learned that the fridge on the right is unacceptable. It is not a refrigerator, according to my family. That is their belief structure. And having water in the door, they don't really care about ice, but water in the door of a refrigerator is worth $1,100. They're willing to, no, they're not willing. They must. They are compelled to pay a 73% premium because of their belief structure about what a refrigerator is. I lobbied for the $1,500 refrigerator because guess what? It's less complex. It is fundamentally less complex. I didn't shift complexity. I just said, I don't need it. I'm willing to live without it to reduce the complexity in my life because guess what? That water dispenser and ice maker is one of the number one maintenance issues on these refrigerators. I know that. I've had to repair them myself. So I'm willing to reduce the complexity. I have a choice. My family insisted there was no choice. Unacceptable, acceptable, or wherever that is. So that's a lesson on belief structures. People have beliefs, and there was no argument. There was no questioning that. It was non-negotiable. So often that was an explicit belief that through conversation we brought forth because I found the options. It's like, $1,100 less for no water in the door? Sign me up. My family said, no, not going to happen. And so I think largely, often you'll see this in business processes, and people have done certain processes or used certain systems for many years in business. People unknowingly cling to certain things that are beliefs. And when it's been around long enough, it's often referenced as a truth or a fact. I was once at a customer. They're a $3 billion public company. I flew out there to help them with their business process challenges. And I'm interviewing these people, and they said, yeah, we run the ABC report. It had something, they called it the boat report, I believe. And I was like, the boat report? You have nothing to do with boats. Why is it called the boat report? They looked at each other. They had no idea. They don't know why this report is called the boat report. They don't know who created it. They don't know how many years it's been around. They don't know why it must be generated every day. But one of their critical business process requirements was to generate the boat report every single day. A boat report, that's what they called it. They had no idea why they called it a boat report. It was a belief system. It was a truth. It was a fact. They had to have this report. Management needs it. They've had it for the last decade. It must look exactly like this. That added complexity, right? So if these things become truths or facts, like sometimes people don't even realize they have such beliefs. And then they become calcified. They become unquestioned. Well, we can't get rid of the boat report. Are you crazy? John in finance would go crazy, and Sally, she'd be so mad if she didn't get her boat report at 8 a.m. Really? Let's not distribute it and see who misses it. But it can be really costly to question those beliefs. You have time, money, ego, politics. Like, it could be really damaging if you start to question things that people believe as truths. But when you don't question these beliefs, you immediately preclude all sorts of alternatives, like not generating the boat report, not distributing the boat report, not worrying about the boat report, or not having to deal with all of the data that it's pulling together from multiple systems in order for it to exist. All of those possibilities gone, precluded from the discussion because we must have the boat report. Okay, just recognize that's a choice. That's not mandatory complexity. And I posted a question on Twitter about the complexity quote that I started with. And thank you, David. I got a few responses, but I think David summarized my thinking. Complexity is usually a choice. Yes, I agree. It is easy to overcomplicate design, but it takes careful thought to take the simple path. Thank you, David. You win the internet today. And can we ask the question, do we really need the boat report? Who's using the boat report? If you don't even know why it's called a boat report, do you really need it? I don't know. I think that's an opportunity for discussion. And what would it mean to not do something, not have some features, not have the water dispenser on the door? You might actually have to sacrifice something. And so back to the opener. Why life can't be simpler. Can't. It cannot be simpler. We also don't want to sacrifice our options and capabilities. Sure sounds like we have a choice there, right? There's no gun at our head. It's like, oh, wait, you mean I have the option to sacrifice options and capabilities in order to achieve simplicity? Tell me more. I want to know about the options to simplify and reduce complexity that the quote earlier said could not be done. It could only be shifted, right? Here's another relevant business example, getting away from refrigerators. Real world example. What payment methods should you accept from customers? this is a choice in the United States, and I don't want to hear the arguments. I know them all very, very well. In the United States, a common set of payment options for customers might be check. Yep, paper check, still very common in the United States. ACH or EFT, automated clearinghouse or electronic funds transfer. Same thing effectively for us. Wire transfer, typically only done for international, occasionally done for expedient payments, electronic, or credit card, right? So I pulled several years of data for the payments I've received, and this is in the ballpark. I didn't really get double check everything, but roughly 83% of my customers paid by credit card, and the remaining 17% were check, ACH, and wire. And in my case, receiving a credit card payment is much simpler, much easier. I'm more than happy to accept the 2.5% fee, whatever I'm paying, in order to accept the credit card, because my processing manual work to deal with that is essentially zero. But when I get a check, it's a hassle. It's not nearly as hard as it used to be. I can do a mobile deposit on my phone, take a photo, but it's just like 5+ minutes, maybe 10 minutes of distraction that I need to deal with. It's a hassle. And then there's all sorts of problems with checks. Well, I mailed it last week. Why didn't you get it? People FedEx me checks overnight. It's absurd. Then there's ACH. The hassle with ACH is it'll just drop in my account. And despite every attempt to configure my banking to notify me, I get no notification for most ACH payments. No idea why. Something about my bank is quirky. So I won't even know I've been paid. I have to constantly monitor it. It's a hassle. I get the payment. I need to go enter it as a receivable. It's not automated. It's disconnected. It's a problem. And there are systems to deal with that, but bear with me. Wire, infrequent, no big deal. So I have a choice. I do. I can say we have to accept all payment types. And then I can complain that it's so horribly complex and time consuming and hassle and I don't get these notifications. But I have a choice. I can say, well, I'm going to stop accepting checks. And guess what? I have roughly 9-10% of customers who might balk at that. They might say, well, we only pay by check. And I have those, trust me. And I could also go further and say, well, ACH and wires, those are kind of a hassle. I'm just going to accept credit card payments. Single payment source, I am going to choose to reduce complexity for myself. But guess what? It's a compromise. It's a compromise for me. It's a compromise for my customers. And guess what? I might have a few customers who decline, say, sorry, we only send checks. Tough. We're not going to pay your invoice. Am I willing to accept that sacrifice of having, say, anywhere from 1 to 17% of my customers lost, go to a competitor, whatever? I don't know. But it's a choice. Don't pretend that you don't have a choice and that you must accept all this complexity and there is no alternative. It simply shifts around, right? So another kind of general analogy is tiny homes, which I find fascinating for several reasons. And, there are a lot of YouTube channels and videos on tiny homes, and I just happen to subscribe to this one because the creativity and the just restraint involved in many of these tiny house builds is truly fascinating, at least from an American perspective, and the old classic story of the big house and the yard and the fancy cars and all this stuff. And when you watch these videos, the level of restraint and constraint that these people have applied to every facet of their life. I mean, everything. Physical, where they sleep, the size of their bathroom, the size of their sink, everything is so highly constrained that they are actively making sacrifices in every square inch of their tiny home in order to achieve something else. So they have simplified so many things. And ironically, I find their process incredibly complex. Like, how do How do you figure all this out, right? It's a massive little puzzle, a massive puzzle that they have figured out how to get all this stuff to work, where to put this tiny house, how to pay for utilities and rent and ownership and the zoning laws, and how do you get electrical hookup, and do you need plumbing or sewer? And like, there's a lot of stuff going on, but they have intentionally constrained themselves. And one way I look at it is they have forcefully reduced complexity of so many dimensions of their lives. So I would argue another example of how complexity is not mandatory. There is no minimum level of complexity that must be accepted for these things, because when we talk about the core of complexity, well, we're rarely at the core. So they have simplified down. So I find these videos fascinating. Like, how did they solve this? There's some people with kids, with dogs. Like, how do you do this? They have figured out ways to simplify and eliminate complexity out of their life. Sure, they made sacrifices, but that was their choice. So with that long-winded diatribe on complexity, it was started with seeing one sentence out of some random email newsletter that I got. And I think we need to stop and think about complexity. Whenever I get into something that's like horribly complex, like something is wrong here. Like, this is a business process. This is software. These are used by human beings. Like, we're not landing a rover on Mars, right? We're entering a payables transaction, a cash receipt. We need financials. Like, it shouldn't be complex. So I question complexity whenever I see it, and I don't take it for granted or assume it's mandatory, because those are all opportunities to produce value by simplifying. You don't need to always shift complexity. It's like, no, you do a little bit of work and the complexity is literally gone. You don't necessarily always have to obfuscate it or hide it or do a bunch of work to pretend that it's not there. You can literally eliminate features. You can literally simplify a function or a form. So I think there's always opportunities there if you disagree with a tenet that there is a law of complexity. And with that, late night, I need water. Have a good one.